Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of Resurrection with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. Resurrection is a novel by the great Russian writer Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, or in the West, simply Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy is considered a giant of the world literature and the author of some of the greatest novels of all time, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Together with Dostoevsky, they make the great Russian pair. Dostoevsky, famous for his psychological insight, more interested in the self, and Tolstoy, more concerned with social conflicts, but both were interested in the individual struggle within Russian society. Tolstoy's biography is sometimes subtitled From Riches to Rags, referring to being born into a well-off, noble family and slowly disposing of the family's wealth, sometimes philanthropically and other times through foolish behavior. Tolstoy is a symbol of empathy and was greatly affected by the suffering of others and showed a lot of compassion, especially for the children. He seemed to be on a mission, a search for simplicity, probably motivated by his empathy for the poor and suffering, and maybe he thought that through it he would find some meaning to his life and a peaceful existence. Tolstoy was a humble human being living a simple life in search of understanding himself, humanity, and the world, and he became a great influence on many others. He believed in a phrase claimed by Christianity that it is better to be hit than to hit, and this idea of nonviolent resistance was used by many 20th century liberation movements, Mahatma Gandhi in India, Martin Luther King in America, and from my personal experience, Poland Solidarity and their resistance against communists in the 1980s, which succeeded in toppling the leftist dictatorship there, and then, like a domino, the governments in the rest of the socialist bloc fell, the final act being the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Pope, John Paul II, was somewhat of a silent leader of the resistance movement in Poland. He came on the official visit in 1979 and said, "If you want to be free, you have to fight, but you cannot kill." What is resurrection about? It is about the effort at personal transformation, spurred by need for self-redemption, and brought by awareness of social injustice inflicted on a large part of humanity. A moral crisis brought by realization of how one has been living his life and what effect it had on others, and also being bothered by the general unfairness of life, and all that inner dilemma leading to spiritual awakening. One may deal with things without love, but you cannot deal with men without it. It cannot be otherwise, because natural love is the fundamental law of human life. It is resurrection through redemption, being reborn as a different person, and also it is redemption through resurrection, redeeming yourself by becoming a different person. The book is an elaboration of Tolstoy's earlier quote, "Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself." A bit of the plot. The novel tells a story of Prince Dmitry Ivanovich Nekhludoff, who seduces and impregnates a young orphan girl, Katyusha, living with his aunts. The girl is expelled from the property, and to survive she turns to prostitution. Years later, Nekhludoff is called to a jury duty, and there he recognizes Katyusha being judged for the murder of one of her clients. Nekhludoff was already going through his moral crisis, and remembering what he did to the girl, he starts to feel responsible for where she ended and decides to help her. But he's not able to save her from being sentenced to hard labor in Siberia, so he offers to marry and follow her, believing that by sharing her suffering he will lessen her plight, and more importantly will find some kind of psychological redemption for himself. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about resurrection? It is one of those great 19th century Russian novels, a critique of the Russian society, the oblivious attitude of the privileged classes toward the suffering of the poor, and the unfairness it created in the country's legal system. The story feels very personal, the result of observation, and being deeply disturbed by what one is seeing. It was clear that everything considered important and good was insignificant and repulsive, and that all this glamour and luxury hid the old, well-known crimes, which not only remained unpunished, but were adorned with all the splendor man can devise. The protagonist, Prince Nekhludoff, is a reflection of Count Tolstoy himself, his inner moral struggles, the savage physical animal versus the spiritual being. It is the animal inside Nekhludoff who seduces and abandons Katyusha, and the spiritual being who wants to save her. As he matures, he becomes more of an observer and a thinker, a modern man, a creation of enlightenment, touched by the general suffering of humanity, which was the result of abuses and inequalities created by the upper classes. Nekhludoff, through reading, becomes influenced by the progressive ideas coming out of Western Europe, and to stay true to those ideals, the image of himself he would like to forge and cultivate, he's thinking about giving up his possessions. He already gave up the property he inherited from his father, and now, after his mother's death, he considers giving up her land to the peasants. Tolstoy, later in life, did divide his property between his wife and children and kept nothing for himself. And throughout his life, probably driven by some inner guilt, he was quick to lose compensation he would receive for his work. Nekhludoff's object of interest, or the ticket for redemption, is Katyusha, and the trial served for Nekhludoff as a type of a mirror to see or remember who he was, and also to realize all his actions are in the end self-serving. He remembered what his last relations with his mother had been, and they also seemed unnatural and disgusting, and this was also shameful and horrid. He remembered how, during the latter period of her illness, he had simply wished her to die. He had said to himself that he wished it for her sake, that she might be released from her suffering, but in reality he wished for his own sake to be released from the sight of her suffering. And he is disgusted with himself as much as with the society. Let them judge me as they like. I could deceive them, but myself I cannot deceive. And suddenly he understood that the aversion he had lately, and particularly today, felt for everybody was an aversion for himself. And strange to say, in this acknowledgement of his baseness there was something both painful yet joyful and quieting. And this relates to the idea that to change the society, one needs to start with himself. Katyusha has her own identity conflict, going from a decent country girl to a city prostitute. Actually, it was Nekhludoff who unintentionally turned her into a prostitute. After their erotic episode, he gave her money, and this probably made her realize that men want only one thing from her and are willing to pay for it. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this, together with financial hardship, was responsible for Katyusha's choice of profession. To embrace her new identity, she decides to forget her past and create a new persona by changing certain personal aspects of herself. Instead of referring to herself as Katyusha, as she was known in her old life, she now is using her last name, Maslova. It is usually imagined that a thief, a murderer, a spy, a prostitute, acknowledging his profession as evil, is ashamed of it. But the contrary is true. People whom fate and their mistakes have placed them in a certain position, however false that position may be, form a view of life in general which makes their position seem good and admissible. And when Nekhludoff appears, Katyusha doesn't recognize him, but he makes sure to refresh her memory, and this brings back the painful memories of the past. Sometime after the memorable night with Nekhludoff, Katyusha discovered she was pregnant, and initially it gave her some kind of hope for the future with the prince, but then Nekhludoff passed through town without stopping to see her, and at this moment the unborn child became a burden, a painful memory, and it eventually died because of Katyusha's neglect. Everybody lived for himself alone, for his pleasure, and all the talk about God and righteousness was deception. And if sometimes doubts arose in her mind, and she wondered why everything was so badly arranged in the world that all hurt each other and made everyone suffer, she thought it best not to dwell on it. Katyusha can sense Nekhludoff is there more for himself than her, looking for his own redemption, not hers. She regretted having neglected the opportunity today of repeating to him once more that she knew him, and would not give in to him, would not let him make use of her spiritually as he had done physically. I think the saying, "you can have my body, but you will never have my soul," claimed by many people, comes from Russia, probably the result of countless wars where raping women was pretty common and accepted. It was a way for the victims to separate themselves from the physical violence and keep their sanity. In the end, Nekhludoff seemed to realize that it was Katyusha who was doing him a favor. Just by being present, she gave him the opportunity for his resurrection, and he concludes it was because she loved him. At the bottom, resurrection is a story about love. It is not a love story, but a story about the importance of love, the unconditional love one can feel that allows to feel empathy and to act with compassion. The whole trouble lies in that people think that there are conditions excluding the necessity of love in their intercourse with men, but such conditions do not exist. Things may be treated without love. One may chop wood, make bricks, forge iron without love, but one can no more deal with people without love than one can handle bees without care. Tolstoy implies that it is the absence of love that is responsible for the misery and suffering in the society. It makes people selfish and driven by self-interest. Even Nekhludoff's motivation to help Katyusha is brought by his need to feel good about himself and to be able to live with who he was. I think the important question the novel is exploring is the nature of altruism. Where does it come from? What is it motivated by? Its results are selfless, but its cause is a need to feel good about oneself. Nekhludoff's actions benefit Katyusha, but his reward is redemption in his own eyes. The other prisoners can sense Nekhludoff's need for redemption and take advantage of it by putting their problems on him, knowing it is difficult for him in the state he is in to ignore them. All our psychological needs come from within and can only be satisfied by ourselves. The others are just accessory to our inner struggle. The story indirectly emphasizes our imperfections as human beings, our ego always lurking under the surface, and a selfish element present even in the most altruistic actions. And this is the tragedy of Nekhludoff's struggle. It is about him benefiting him the most, and gain of others is a byproduct of his self-directed action. How can you possibly hope to reform her after the life she's been leading? It's not her I'm wanting to reform, it's me, he replied. The plot is Nekhludoff's personal journey away from his old self, wealth and title, searching for redemption and trying to find his new self, somebody he could live with, to be resurrected.